Good morning to welcome you to the long-term rate-making study draft presentation of the Interagency Rates Working Group. So for today, we'll do a quick introduction and background, and we'll turn it over to our consultant team, E3, to give the presentation of the draft study, and then we'll open it up to public comments and questions thereafter. So with that, we'll dive right in. For repeat folks or stakeholders, this will be some review, but if you're just joining us for the very first time, the Interagency Rates Working Group is a coordination between the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center, the Department of Energy Resources, and the Attorney General's Office. We established this in light of the existing electric rates jeopardizing the Commonwealth's clean energy goals, and was formed to advance near and long-term electric rate designs and rate making that aligns with the Commonwealth's decarbonization goals. So we've worked through the near-term rate strategy with many of the stakeholders who I see as familiar names to put together the process for the near-term rate strategy and incorporate feedback from many of you to address near-term electrification through rate design offerings. Some generally been the options that are before us prior to the widespread deployment of advanced metering infrastructure. And now we turn to the long-term rate-making study, which will present a vision and recommendations for rate-making mechanisms and rates associated with the rollout of advanced metering technologies. So we have kind of two buckets here of regulatory and rate-making mechanisms that incentivize least cost distribution investments, incentivize improved grid reliability, communication resiliency, and promote DERs, and rates that can accommodate transportation and building electrification, in addition to new loads, provide appropriate price signals to affect load management and minimize or mitigate impacts on ratepayers, in particular, low and moderate or other vulnerable populations. So the focus of today will be on the long-term rate-making study. And we will be looking at, in this study, we'll be looking at rate design and reviewing potential rate design options for Massachusetts with the deployment of advanced metering infrastructure, as well as regulatory and rate-making mechanisms and the current or existing mechanisms in the Commonwealth, with attention to where there are potentially barriers to decarbonization and affordable electrification. And so the long-term study will be accompanied by the Interagency Rates Working Group recommendations following our multiple stakeholder opportunities or engagement opportunities that we'll discuss a little bit briefly after this first presentation. I'll pass it off to my colleague Sarah from the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center to continue our introduction and prior to handing it off to E3.
Great, thanks, Austin. Sarah Cullinan, I direct the Net Zero Grid program at MassCC, and part of the IRWG. So in terms of process, there'll be all listed here opportunities to key into what we're doing in this effort. We're in that kind of second bucket of long-term rate-making study timeline right now. So we have that presentation today from E3 on their initial draft of the study. We will have a series of stakeholder feedback meetings over the next week. And then after that, the IRWG team will develop recommendations and next steps. So I'm gonna go to the next slide, Austin. This is just the calendar showing when all of these things are landing. These slides will be available after, so you can take note. There's a couple other updates we wanted to provide. One is, thanks to some of the very great feedback that we received early on from stakeholders, we decided to expand the capacity of our consulting team to integrate an energy justice expert who will be reviewing the work product and providing some supplementary assessment and analysis. The expert's name is Dr. Destiny Knock of People's Energy Analytics. She also teaches out of Carnegie Mellon University. She's provided expert witness support and some DPU dockets previously. We are excited to have her on board. She's just kind of now diving in over the last week or two, and we hope to provide an update to stakeholders from her on her work in the coming weeks. So stay tuned for when we're able to schedule that. Here's just notes on how to provide feedback after this. We'll be accepting written feedback through November 15th. In addition to the workshop series over the next week that, or week plus, that anyone can participate in. And that brings us to E3. Over to you, Yvonne and Andrew.
Thanks, Sarah. So we can start in on the next slide here. So yeah, thanks everyone for signing on today. We're excited to kind of be back in front of this whole group, talking about rates once again, and so you'll hear a little bit from me and then also from my colleague Yvonne, as Sarah said, kind of updating folks on our thinking for the long-term rate making part of this study. So a little bit of an outline here. It's of course high level, but we want to just touch on study context and kind of bridging from context. Such a big part of future rate making is just understanding what the system will look like in the 2030s and beyond. So we'll spend a bit of time just understanding that context for future rate setting, and then get into more specific ideas like time varying rates and rate making in the future. So on our next slide, we are too forward, I suppose. We have here just a bit of a reminder of what in my mind is the sort of problem statement from our near-term rates work, which is that our CECP, right, our guide to how we want to decarbonize the state, tells us that we need to electrify, and two of the most important things to electrify are the transportation sector and the building sector. So specifically, vehicles and heating. And so we've got some pretty aggressive goals for how that decarbonization happens, how that electrification happens. But we highlighted in our near-term report that we run into an issue pretty quickly, which is that houses switching from natural gas heating to heat pump heating under current rates end up seeing a bill increase. And here we're seeing in the right-hand chart an increase of basically $100 per month on average across the year for for this particular example customer. And so we have this mismatch of actual rates basically showing an incentive that that directly misaligns with our policy goals. And so that sort of set us off on the near-term rates piece, and we'll touch in a couple slides on what we thought were some pretty good solutions to that. But I just want to with this slide say this problem's not going away, right? As we get into our long-term rate making view, right, into the 2030s and beyond, the goal is that we'll have even more heat pumps out there, even more electric vehicles out there. And so, the concerns of affordability for electrification that were really present in our near-term study remain just as present in the long-term study, but the context around them is going to change. And so we'll talk about, how that changing context kind of changes the approaches that we need to think about. So we can go forward a slide here. So key questions that we're exploring here, and then we'll get to, as Yvonne and I speak today. We want to understand the key drivers of electric system cost growth as we, reach into the 2030s and beyond. And then, understanding the sources of cost growth, right? What costs are kind of driving our electric prices, and we can start to think about time varying rates in a really informed way, and to think about the best practices and how we define time varying rates to appropriately reflect system costs and provide signals to customers, both just who have responsive and sort of non or less responsive loads, and DERs for how those customers can basically save money for themselves, and in doing so save money for the whole system. After this the kind of view into TVR, then we want to zoom out a step further and just think about the regulatory construct as a whole. Think about traditional cost of service rate making and the pieces that we might want to change or augment about that to kind of help us along in this journey to keep up with the changing electric system and make sure that we're able to provide safe and reliable service, but at an affordable price. And then the last piece here is kind of coming out of that discussion of what can we do on the regulatory cost of service side of things. We think that we need to actually open our view even a little bit wider and start to think about components of the electric rates that could be shifted outside of ratepayer cost recovery as we continue to think about what we'll need to do for decarbonization, but trying to maintain affordability at the same time and really keeping that as a priority. So I hinted at our near-term study before and the sort of problem statement of it. I want to remind folks of the solution statement of it, I guess, at the same time. I think some of this is still being figured out, but hopefully folks remember a bit of this figure on the right-hand side here, where we're showing the change in monthly average energy expenditure for a household that electrifies. So the left-hand set of columns for a household adding a heat pump, the right-hand side for adding a heat pump in an electric vehicle. And I don't plan on going over these results in great detail again, but I want to point out the sort of two most promising levers to rate design that we explored, as highlighted by the text on the left-hand side of the slide. One of them being that through higher fixed charges, right, shifting charges that are related to policy or other sort of fixed pieces of the bill can reduce customer bills for electrifying customers. And again, reminder, the idea there is that when we shift costs out of volumetric recovery into something like a fixed charge, then that means that electrifying, adding more kilowatt hours doesn't necessarily mean adding as much to your bill. Of course, there's been historical concern over increasing fixed costs, but we've seen really exciting examples lately, especially in California, of how we can set up something like a low income protection there through tiered fixed costs that vary by income level. The other thing we're pointing out here is our look into like a high winter discount rate. And so this would be like a technology specific rate for folks with heat pumps. And the idea there is that these heat pumps, at least in the near term, are adding load, but they're not really adding much cost to the system. And so we can sort of pass through supply costs, but a lot of the more infrastructure related costs don't really need to be recovered by the extra kilowatt hours that we're seeing in the winter from these heating customers. And so we're able to decrease the winter rate, give folks a break there, and therefore actually show some bill savings for folks who are switching from, in this case, gas to heat pump heating. And this approach is one that we're seeing adopted by Unitil now, and now there's an order out there also for National Grid to come up with a rate similar to this. But we want to caution, and this is sort of a preview of some of what we'll talk about in just a moment, that this strategy won't work forever, right? We expect this system to switch over to winter peaking as we electrify more end uses, and that'll happen, in maybe 10 years, give or take. And so we need to make sure that, if we're setting up a seasonal rate like this, that we're prepared, that customers are prepared, the utilities are prepared, that everyone's prepared for this rate to shift and to not be, sort of statically offering a really nice winter discount forever, because the costs, in fact, will be changing. So yeah, we can get another slide ahead here and start to talk about that. So I think we've said it a few times already, but it bears repeating. This is an incredible time of change for the electric sector. And so we need rates that keep up with that change, right? We need our rates to be ready to evolve as the cost drivers of the system evolve, and as the ability of consumers to respond to cost signals changes too. What we're showing here in the bottom set of graphics is just the change of our sort of like system peak over time. So I think folks will be aware that currently we are a summer peaking system, and I'll just note these curves are all normalized in a way. So no labels on the left-hand axis here, but it's sort of a normalized megawatts sort of scale. But the shift from 2023 to 2040 is not meant to imply that our summer peak is shrinking at all, but rather just that we're rescaling these graphics so we can understand that the winter peak is becoming the dominant one. But yeah, so we'll move from the summer peaking system today into dual peaking sometime in the mid-2030s. And then eventually we expect that the winter peak will actually dwarf the summer peak. And that's a huge change for an electrical system, both in terms of how we operate it and how we plan for it, where we're spending our money, and sort of what usage at what times of year and even times of day is driving that sort of need for infrastructure build. Of course, this does all carry some uncertainty with it, and part of it depends on our success at designing rates that encourage electrification. Right? If we get more heating electrification happening, then we'll probably see that winter peak sooner. But also we have a hope to sort of manage all of this new load in a way that we can sort of mitigate that winter peak as it forms, which again we'll talk about as we go on here. But the key thing I want to stress here is just that I think rates in the electrical system have for a long time historically been somewhat static in terms of how they operate, and that's been fine. But now the system is changing a lot, and so rates need to be ready to also change. Not just today, but be ready to keep changing as the system continues to evolve. So we can move forward a slide and talk about how our costs will change as the system continues to evolve. We see three drivers that we really want to highlight here as being the pieces that are driving our costs sort of into the future. The first one, having to do with just existing load, is that we have all of this grid modernization that has to happen just in order to operate the grid, basically, how it needs to be operated in the modern context, right? With DERs out there, with maintaining reliability and resiliency in sort of the changing context of the world around us, and just replacing old aging infrastructure with the new. So there's a whole category of costs just for sort of upkeeping and improving the system based on even flat load levels. Next up, there's the piece that I think we've already been talking about a bit, which is that we don't expect flat load levels. We expect incremental peak growth, and a lot of that coming from electrification and transportation. And so as whatever the system peak is, be it winter or summer, grows, then we need to make sure that we're building out our system to be able to meet that peak. And then the last piece here is also just that we are investing in a huge amount of new clean energy, clean electricity sources. And with that, there is also a whole bunch of just system build out necessary, right? Building those new energy sources, but also the transmission capacity needed to get to them, et cetera. And on that, we can go to the next slide. That middle piece on incremental peak growth, not surprisingly, is going to be the highlight of a lot of the discussion today, because that's the piece that we can do the most about. So one thing that's really important to recall, and this sort of goes back to our near-term rates findings also, is that load increasing on the electric system does not necessarily mean that costs need to increase. So presently, we're a summer peaking system, we can add load to the winter, and it doesn't really change the cost of the system in terms of our infrastructure needed to serve that load. As we become a winter peaking system, that story changes, of course. But what this graphic from ISO New England is showing is that even just on the transmission side, there's a potential for $7 to $10 billion in savings by 2050 if we do a good job of managing that winter peak growth. And so, we can't really underscore enough. This is only just the transmission part, so there's going to be more savings in other parts of the system. This is something that we absolutely need to take care of, and make sure that we're sort of managing our peak growth, sending the right signals to customers, so that we're taking advantage of the flexible loads out there. And I think, as Vivon will highlight a little bit later, that means EVs. To some extent, that means water heating and space conditioning. Maybe we'll have to see what we can do there. That is a big piece, and we're hoping we can do something. But it's also one of the harder pieces to shift around in a cold climate. So with that, I will hand things over to Vivon.
Thanks, Andrew. Great. Thank you, Austin. Yeah, so I'll be walking through a couple of different elements of time varying rate design, or TVR rate design, and really sort of give you a lay of the land of how we've been thinking about it in terms of guidelines and best practices for how to set this up, with the overarching goal, as Andrew mentioned, of managing peaks and aligning customer price signals with the shape of avoided costs on the system over the course of a year and over the course of a day. And so first, we want to start with this sort of framing point, which is that TVR design is really art and science, in that there's this central spectrum that we have to be aware of, which we've shown here. On the left is TVR options that are more limited in their complexity, which is to say they're easier to understand. And so they're easier for customers to engage with, which is a huge benefit. But at the same time, if you're sort of sacrificing some degree of granularity in terms of how well you are mapping your rate options to the overall system costs, then you're providing customers and their loads less of an opportunity to respond to those system conditions. And so there's really that balance there, which is at the heart of this point here. And one thing that we haven't mentioned here is that like the consequences of inflexibility are another important dimension here. If you have a simpler rate that the customer can easily understand, chances are if they have inflexible loads and they aren't really able to reduce their peak demand or change their the sort of pattern of their consumption over the course of a day, then they won't be penalized quite as much as what we see on the right-hand side. So to go to the right-hand side, the other extreme is options that are much more complex in that the time granularity of the rate option is much higher. But at the same time, if customers do learn how to respond to those and are able to respond to those and are enabled by the technologies that they have to respond to those signals, then there's a much greater opportunity to actually avoid system costs, because it's a closer alignment of what the customer sees and what the system costs are. And so, keeping that spectrum in mind, there's a couple of different flavors of TVR that we want to walk you through today. The first on the left is time of use blocks, and we'll go into each of these in more detail. Time of use blocks, or TOU blocks, are the TVR structure that's most commonly used across the country for residential rates today. At minimum, it includes some kind of higher price during on-peak hours. So the times of the day when the system is most stressed, having a higher volumetric rate then, and having a lower electricity rate, lower volumetric rate at other hours of the day. So that's the first, time of use blocks. Then in the middle, we have more sophisticated options that are more of an opt-in basis, or are primarily offered to other customer classes today, such as commercial and industrial customers. So this includes critical peak pricing, or CPP, where driven by this understanding that Andrew laid out, that there's a few key hours of the year that are really driving system costs. It's those peak hours that are driving system costs. You can sort of concentrate the higher costs that the customer sees into those hours. And we'll show you what this looks like in practice. In a similar level of complexity are peak period demand charges, where instead of charging for on an energy basis, you're charging on a sort of instantaneous demand basis. Also common amongst C&I customers today, but less common amongst residential customers. And then finally, on the more complex side of things, you have dynamic rates, which are actually quite straightforward to understand in that you have a real-time pricing scheme, and your customer is just exposed to real-time prices. And this has a host of concerns and opportunities associated with that, which we'll get into shortly. But the key point to take away here is that really art and science, you want to make sure that you have a rate that is easy for your customer to understand and engage with, but also ideally one that reflects system costs, so that if the customer responds the way we want them to, then the overall system costs are reduced. Next slide, please. Thanks. So, as I mentioned, TOU blocks are the most common one today, offered by utilities across the country. And I'll start by looking at the figures on the right, and then I'll shift over to the explanation here. So what we've done here is we've taken Massachusetts-specific avoided cost data, put together in other work streams called the AESC, and we're looking at 2035 specifically, when we expect the sort of shape of the system to be dual peaking or almost winter peaking. And what we see here on the top and the bottom is a winter time of use rate and a summer time of use rate, which would be part of the same offering to a customer. And we're cautioning this as illustrative because there's a lot of different elements that would go into a rate design like this that are sort of behind the scenes and a little too technical for today's discussion. But we want to get the point across that this is what a TOU rate option could look like in a dual peaking or winter peaking system for Massachusetts. And so on the x-axis, we have the hours of the day going from 12 a.m. to 12 a.m. And on the y-axis, we have our volumetric rate. And so the fixed monthly charge is sort of out of the picture and happening behind the scenes, but the y-axis is showing the total volumetric rate that the customer is exposed to. And so first element, the gray bar at the bottom, which we're calling the embedded costs. This reflects the embedded system costs that can't really be avoided, even if customers change their demand and change the shape of their load consumption. And so this reflects like distribution system costs, for example, and we'll go into more detail about this language of avoidable versus embedded later on. But assuming that there's some embedded cost to begin with, and then there's an avoidable set of costs that vary over the course of a day. And so for the hours of the day where the system is not that stressed, you have a lower volumetric rate. But then during these key hours of like 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., you have an increasing volumetric rate that the customer is exposed to, or an on-peak price. You'll see that the winter on-peak price is much higher than the summer on-peak price, and that's because of the system cost element that that we've been talking about, where as you have your rising winter peaks, that drives transmission need and that drives generation capacity need. And so the on-peak periods during the winter are just much more expensive for the system than the summer. So that's the snapshot of what your TOU rates could look like. And now to give you some more detail on what the sort of goals are here. The first is that we really want customers to respond to these price signals, and we want them to reduce their consumption during peak hours and reduce the peak for the system and shift that consumption into off-peak hours when the system is less expensive. And the second is that we ideally want rates to be cost reflective. And so if the system costs are shaped in such a way where it is more expensive to consume electricity during those hours, then we would want the rates to reflect that. And I'll end again with the same point about art versus science. Most utilities today aren't really taking the same embedded versus avoidable cost approach. It's more of more commonly trying to sort of find the balance of how they think customers will respond, so perceived customer preferences, as well as like demand elasticity. So how much of a reduction in peak load you'd expect to get with different pricing. But what we're presenting here is what we think is a useful framework for thinking of these costs as embedded versus avoidable, and making sure that the avoidable costs really represent the system avoidable costs. And the last point over here, which is a small bullet, but a crucial bullet that we're going to dedicate some discussion to down the line, is that if you do go for these cost-based rates, then as Andrew mentioned, that means winter heating would be exposed to a higher rate in the future. And that's really our sort of central problem statement that we want to focus on. Next slide, please. So now to go a layer deeper in how we'd expect customers to respond, how we'd expect them to respond today versus what we ideally would want, what their response could look like in the future, and what the sort of the goalposts are. And so today, if us to look at the two charts on the right, so we're looking at the daily energy consumption of a single customer, again on the coldest day of 2035, and there's three different stacks here. The first is space heating energy demand, which is easily the most energy demand, but the highest energy demand category for that house. The second is other end uses. So your washer, your dryer, your cooking, that fits into the other end uses. And then finally, the purple wedge is the EV charging. And we first want to show what an unmanaged EV charging profile could look like, where during this critical on-peak period of 4 p.m. to 8 p.m., the unmanaged charging approach is you get home from work, you plug your car in, but then you're charging at the worst possible time, versus a managed EV charging profile, which is the bottom chart, where you shift your charging load to a different point in the day, specifically further on. And ideally, you'd have technology to enable this so that you can still plug your car in, but there's some enabling technology that allows for your car to start charging later on when the system costs aren't as high. And so that's really point one here, that EV load flexibility is the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to peak load reduction today. The second more difficult point to swallow is that space heating and cooling is likely to be less flexible, especially if you take this snapshot of the coldest day or the hottest day. Folks are less likely to change their space conditioning energy usage because there's a serious sort of health need in that moment to respond to the weather and condition your home accordingly. And so the point here is that it might be difficult to rely on space conditioning flexibility when designing these loads. And then the second, more of a call to arms, is that it really underscores the importance of technologies that enhance the energy efficiency of a home and can reduce peak impacts, such as building shell insulation, getting better windows, air sealing, the whole sort of package of energy efficiency upgrades that allows your home to retain heat or to retain cool in the summer, as well as very efficient technologies such as ground source heat pumps, or even more innovative nascent technologies such as network geothermal systems, which are just far more efficient and as a result have less of a peak load. And also crucial to mention here is energy storage for each household to reduce their peak demand during those on-peak hours. And then the last point we want to flag here is that for folks with inflexible loads, if you aren't able to move your EV charging or any other load that you have, and you just end up having a high peak demand, this would lead to increased bill volatility for you. And so for those vulnerable customers that are likely unable to flex their load around, an opt-in approach could be useful, which is something that California did, where low-income customers in hot climates were able to opt into TOU rates versus the default of having it be opt-out. And so a similar strategy could be employed in Massachusetts to protect vulnerable customers with the concern of inflexible loads. Conversely, the other point here is that opt-in versus opt-out, if it's an opt-in rate, you will likely see reduced system benefits from lower enrollment. Next slide, please. So continuing in our sojourn towards increased complexity. So the next stage is seen as critical peak pricing, or CPP, where the focus is really on a few key hours of the year when the system costs are highest. And so it's seen as an important next step because the more granular price signals could reduce peak demand in those key hours, and it's more cost reflective. And a critical difference from time of use rates is that because the price premium in those hours is set to be so much higher in CPP schemas, the aim is not just load flexibility, but also load curtailment in those key hours. And so the total sort of impact that you see for system costs is even higher because of that added curtailment. And so to demystify what this looks like, there's really a trade-off that CPP rates offer. You see a small discount in electricity rates over most of the year, but then a dramatically higher price during key periods. And so to quickly shift over to this graphic here, what we're showing is the CPP pilot rate offered by SMUD, which is the Sacramento Municipal Utility District, utility in California, where you see small savings in off-peak and mid-peak rates for the summer, but during CPP calls, so the way a CPP rate would work is that there's some agreed upon number of calls where the utility will say, tomorrow, like during these hours, here, the electricity rates are going to be dramatically higher. And so during those calls, there's a 50-cent adder on top of the volumetric rate. So it goes all the way up to an 84-cent per kilowatt hour, dramatically high volumetric rate. And so customers are then heavily encouraged to curtail their load or just avoid that window at all costs. And so, again, critical framing here is that if you're able to flex your loads and reduce your peak demand, you're saving yourself as well as the whole electric system a lot of costs. But at the same time, if you have inflexible loads, then you really do get dinged very hard here. And so the costs of inflexibility are that much higher with critical peak pricing. And so because of this potential downside, it's often offered as an opt-in program, and even here, as flexible loads become more common, it could become more default, as well as if they're enabling technologies that sort of help this happen in the background, rather than forcing a customer to actively change their load around to meet these signals. Next slide, please. So a brief aside on demand charges, which were another element that we flagged. The two flavors that you primarily have are non-coincident peak demand charges versus peak period or coincident peak demand charges. Non-coincident peak charges look at a customer's maximum monthly energy use, regardless of when it occurs. And so it's really seen as a cost recovery mechanism for embedded costs, and there's a pretty clear tie to cost causation. And the goal here is not really to avoid peak period usage, and so it's not really geared towards avoidable forward-looking costs. And so that's where NCP demand charges fit in. Conversely, coincident peak or peak period demand charges look at a customer's maximum usage during a specific peak window. And so in practice, this looks similar to an on-peak volumetric adder or a CPP adder. And so it achieves a similar outcome. And coincident peak demand charges are offered to commercial and industrial customers today. But since they achieve a similar outcome, there is a question to be asked about whether it is more beneficial than an on-peak TOU design or a CPP design, given some of the sort of additional complexity that these demand charges offer versus the impact that they elicit. Next slide, please. So then furthest along in our increasing complexity of options is real-time pricing, where the customer sees the most granular price signals. And this is also called dynamic rates. And what we see here on the chart on the right is the total wholesale energy prices, including some of those avoidable costs, such as generation capacity and transmission costs. And you see a significant amount of variability over the course of a year. And with real-time pricing, the customer is sort of subjected to this variability. And so given the potential bill volatility impacts, we think that it's sort of premature to expose residential customers to this. However, there are a couple of promising ideas for potential pilots. The first is that with more grid participation enabling technologies that sort of happen in the background without that much active customer management, for highly flexible end uses such as EV charging, there are certainly benefits to be won from exposing just those highly flexible end uses to real-time pricing. And in a similar vein, for customers that are already very flexible or more sophisticated, such as commercial and industrial customers, that might be a better starting point to see the impact of real-time pricing before sort of rolling it out to residential customers at scale. So that's the snapshot of real-time pricing. Next slide, please. So now that we've outlined all of the different TVR we've outlined the TVR options that we wanted to focus on for today, there's some important considerations that we want to flag for you. The first is that as you get future rate changes, there'll need to be some reconsideration of how DER compensation and incentive programs interact with these advanced rates. And so what we see here on the right is, again, over the course of a day, first off, the purple bars are the TOU, the example TOU rate that we looked at, which has mostly a lower rate, but then a much higher on-peak rate. And we're focusing just on the avoidable portion, not the embedded portion. The dotted line shows the sort of avoidable system costs over the course of the day, which is to say how we want customers to respond to avoid avoid that high cost window. And then we've overlaid the existing programs that focus on DER, specifically storage compensation. The first is the orange Clean Peak Standard discharge window, which incentivizes discharge during a specific time. And in this case, we can see that it's pretty well aligned with what the time of use rate option would look like, which is great. And we'd want that alignment to continue going forward. But then the second is net energy metering, or NEM, and the discharge window that is incentivized during for customers with net energy metering. And so what we see here is that because of the way NEM is currently set up, batteries may preferentially dispatch to serve on-site load rather than focusing on dispatching during the key peak period. And so the focus isn't really aimed at peak reduction, system peak reduction. And so the point that arises here is that there'll need to be some sort of alignment of price signals that customers with these DERs are exposed to across rates and different programs. And an important point to flag here is the second bullet here, which is about in the long run, the sort of simplest price signal that might emerge for DERs is a symmetric import and export rate that reflects these avoidable system costs that we've been talking about. But all customers are subject to a non-bypassable charge that reflects the embedded system costs. And then the last point here that we do want to flag is that combining rates and programs inherently has the risk of compensating customers sort of multiple times for the same system benefit that they're offering. But at the same time, it's important to acknowledge that both rates and programs sort of serve their own unique role in encouraging DER adoption and efficient dispatch to align with system needs. And so there is a place for both, but there's just a need for close coordination of the two to make sure that the customer sees a clear signal. Next slide, please. And so the final point we want to end on for TVR is really this warning that Andrew laid out in the beginning, which is that in a winter peaking electric system, there's a significant cost challenge for electric heating. And the near-term rate that we outlined earlier sort of acts as an effective bridge, but there is a challenge in the longer term when we reach the point where where the costs of electric winter heating are just high for the system. And so what we've shown here on the right is our near-term seasonal heat pump rate today versus the example time of use rate that we've been showing in 2035. The top two charts look at what bills look like for each month, whereas the bottom charts are a reminder of what the total system net load shape looks like, or gross load shape looks like over the course of a year. And so the main point to take away here is that, as you can see, the months of January, December, extremely high expense, given that system costs are highest during these hours. And again, we've sort of cautioned that these are illustrative because of the underlying rate levels potentially, but the underlying rate levels necessarily being different today versus 2035. But this is a conservative view looking at taking Massachusetts specific avoided costs and so setting this up in such a way where we're looking at just today's rate levels, which is a sort of rabbit hole in itself. But the point there being that the top right chart could look a lot worse in the future with rate level growth. And so again, the sort of call to action here that we want to end on is that there needs to be a focus on technology and policy solutions that reduce peak loads with the aim of reducing system costs, and then as a result, reducing rates and bills for customers. This includes energy efficiency, as we mentioned, improved building shell measures, highly efficient technologies such as ground source heat pumps, the more nascent technologies such as thermal energy storage, network geothermal. These also could play a very significant role in reducing peak load. And then finally, load management and demand response programs as well for other flexible end uses. The more that we can reduce the system peak, the lower the sort of cost challenges borne by everyone. Next slide, please. So now, to take a step back, we have a couple of slides that focus on what rate making in the future could look like, as a sort of 30,000-foot view of what rate making looks like today, and what are some promising options out there to view rate making differently and to potentially reduce this cost burden that we see for the future. And so the first point that we want to make is really this framing that we've been using till now of how we could view electric system costs. To look at the figure first, the bill on the left is today's bill, where there's a small fixed portion and then all a high variable cost associated with the volumetric rate. And for that same set of costs, you could break that down into the policy or program costs, the embedded costs that have already been spent, and then avoidable costs in each year that are avoidable through changes in customer energy usage. And so starting from the top, as we've mentioned till now, those avoidable costs should be in rates and should be the benefit of having those in rates is that you then allow customers to change their energy usage patterns and thus avoid those costs. The next tranche, the embedded costs, these are primarily distribution system costs. They could be recovered through a non-bypassable charge, like a non-bypassable volumetric charge, or through a fixed charge, or to sort of expand the Overton window, could be recovered through tax revenues, like any other public infrastructure project. And a brief aside here is that there are sort of parallel efforts in the state to explore this question of shifting costs away from electric ratepayers. And we aren't going into this as much detail as that other effort led by the Office of Energy Transformation. So that's just a point to flag here. And then finally, there's the costs of programs that support policy goals, which aren't really tied to electric system costs. And so these costs could be recovered outside of rates, and doing so would be more progressive than the current system, where if they were to be recovered through taxes, for example, it'd be more progressive than recovering it through volumetric rates, as is the case today. Next slide, please. So this is a brief overview of what the traditional cost of service model is today versus some advanced rate making mechanisms that are out there that have the potential to better align utility performance and public interest. And so the first point we want to make is the traditional cost of service model enables utilities to earn this regulated rate of return on capital investments. And that doesn't really provide a clear incentive for efficient capital spending. And in fact, incentivizes greater capital investment. And there isn't really a clear signal to utilities to prioritize energy affordability or pursuing other important goals such as decarbonization. And so that's where other rate making mechanisms come into play, which are already in place in Massachusetts. A number of these are already in place in Massachusetts, but we've included them here as a to sort of to make sure that we're talking about them and could like expand the scale at which they're applied in the state. And so first is the sort of family of performance-based rate making mechanisms. PBR for short has sort of blurry boundaries in terms of what it encompasses. But what we've included here are reporting metrics, scorecard metrics, performance incentive mechanisms, and earning sharing mechanisms, which really focus on making sure that utilities are reporting specified metrics to regulators, and then they're seeing clear financial incentives to pursue these important goals that are sort of outside of rate making otherwise, and that the sort of benefits of good performance are shared with ratepayers as well. This is a 30,000-foot view of what's happening there. And an example is that the recent national grid rate case, there were 2 performance incentive mechanisms approved, focusing on the utility solar plus storage program enrollment, as well as the low income discount rate enrollment, which wouldn't sort of necessarily be captured otherwise in the traditional cost of service model. Then you have revenue decoupling, where you're sort of breaking this tie between the revenue that utilities garner versus the sales that they versus their sales over the course of a year, and making sure that the ratepayers are seeing the benefits of sort of greater than expected sales. And then finally, there's the context around rate plans. So multi-year rate plans and formula rates are sort of a different way of viewing utility rate cases with an expanded time window and a different way of establishing the utility revenue requirement. And so the advantages here is that you reduce the regulatory burden on utilities, thereby saving costs for ratepayers. In increasing the certainty of revenue that they get, you're able to reduce their borrowing costs, again benefiting ratepayers, and then you're creating the strong incentive to increase the overall sort of operational efficiency of the utility. And so again, that would be sort of a joint incentive for both utilities as well as ratepayers. And again, want to flag that Massachusetts already has a lot of these in place, and we're including them here as a sort of sign that we want that these are promising options and could be scaled up. And we do want to we do want to include this sort of parting thought that there are some important risks embedded here, in that reduced scrutiny of utility expenditures is a risk here with some of these options, and that could lead to higher costs for ratepayers, and that setting this up in such a way also does have the sort of possibility of utilities gaming this incentive structure, and that doesn't really go away with PBR. So the cautions sort of need to be here as well. Next slide, please. And so this is the final slide that I'll be talking about before handing it back to Andrew. And here we want to really sort of hone in on the point that state financing could further reduce costs for electric ratepayers. When you think of that tranche of costs that we showed a couple of slides ago, state financing could help reduce those individual wedges through a couple of different ways. The first is that public financing could use lower borrowing rates, which would then reduce the cost of clean energy contracts. This is just one example that we've cited here from California, where California's community choice aggregators, or CCAs, came together to form this sort of joint financing authority that used their lower borrowing rates to fund renewable energy development at a lower cost, thus securing their customers sort of a lower cost supply rate. And the central point here is that they have a lower borrowing rate, and so that could be used in the Commonwealth as well. And then the next sort of version of this could also be state debt being used to finance utility-owned projects. There was an example in California that didn't pass, but would have set up a decarbonization authority that would have used state debt to finance different clean energy projects. And the benefit here again is that the borrowing costs are lower than utility borrowing costs, but there's a sort of smaller benefit because in both investor-owned utilities and publicly owned utilities have sort of lower costs of capital, publicly owned utilities especially, and so some of those benefits are limited. And then it also raises questions outlined here on the last point about ownership and maintenance, and like would the state own those projects, would the utility own them, and what is the sort of utility's mandate if the state has financed these large infrastructure projects. And so this is sort of an open-ended note to finish on, but the central point we want to make here is that in our winter peaking system, where it's sort of a bleak outlook for electric heating, all of these options need to be considered about ways to reduce electric ratepayer burden, and state financing is a promising option. So I'll hand it back to Andrew to wrap us up.
Great, thanks, Vivan. I'll take just a few minutes here to just summarize some key takeaways and sort of future-looking thoughts, and then we can open the floor up for general comment. Starting on takeaways, we saw Vivan explain kind of early in his section that TVR is, just saying we're doing TVR doesn't tell us a whole lot, right? There's a whole range of options there, from the more granular, more cost reflective, but also more volatile, to the sort of like more protected, less risky, but also with lower potential for actual cost savings for both the system and the customer. And so as we get AMI in place and as we explore our TVR options, we'll want to just be thinking critically about that entire spectrum and sort of where we want to land on that. And even if we want to sort of land in it for different places for different sorts of customers or end uses. We also talked through, in terms of TVR, some, I think, well-motivated thoughts on how you can design a time of use rate or any sort of time varying rate to reflect avoidable system costs, right? So understanding the different sort of categories of costs, right? What's already embedded versus what is actually avoidable, and then making sure that we're sort of aligning our high price periods with those most avoidable system costs, so that we're signaling during those times for customers to help the system out. And of course, I think, as both of us stressed, we can't talk about how we're setting those time varying windows without throwing in again and again the caution that this is a really dynamic electric system that we're working with right now, right? We're going to see so much change in the next 5 to 10 to 20 years. And so we have to be setting ourselves up with time varying rates that are able and expected to evolve as the system costs change in terms of timing and magnitude. We've seen in jurisdictions that already have time varying rates, many designs that favor just a sort of simple time of use rate as a default, but then more complex options, maybe on an opt-in basis. This is an important thing to think about as we really strongly consider, as Vivan said, sort of the cost of inflexibility and how this rates future looks for customers that may not have the ability to respond to rate signals, through having like enabling technology or for whatever other reason. So we need to, just be carefully thinking about that as part of the design, also understanding sort of what we're exposing our more vulnerable customers to. Sort of on the opposite end of that, there's opportunity in something like real-time pricing, but again, we want to be careful that we're tying that, at least in the early phases, or certainly in the early phases, if not even in later phases, to our sort of more enabled end uses, more flexible end uses, and to customers who are sort of like engaged and ready for that. And then the last part here, going back to this idea that the winter peaking grid is coming, and that will increase costs for heating customers, and the sort of silver bullet for that isn't identified, and frankly, there is no single silver bullet for that. So it's going to take a sort of all of the above approach, try to manage costs in a system that is winter peaking and has a lot of electrified heating. So, there are roles for sort of all the levers that we've got at our disposal for time varying rates, setting up non-bypassable charges, looking at all the sort of performance-based rate making mechanisms that we've got at our disposal, and thinking about changes to cost recovery. And I think Vaughn did well to sort of call it a call to action or a call to arms, that this is a flag that we need to be investing now and thinking now about how we can set ourselves up to create more flexible winter load through things like building shell measures just to be able to keep the heat in, take advantage of things like preheating, but then also things like ground source heat pumps that stay more efficient in the coldest days, network geothermal, thermal storage at various scales. And I think the state's done well already to be exploring most, if not all, of these options. But I think there's a good call in all of this to recognize that we're talking about things that are somewhat out there in the long term, but there's still action that ought to be taken today to be making sure that we're prepared for this long-term reality. And that sort of brings us to our next slide, where we're just talking about some pieces of basically future topics, like things that are flagged by this study, but still a bit open, and we think require additional work to again set us all up for the future that we're seeing. So just better understanding TVR customer responsiveness at various scales, digging further into alternative rate making mechanisms, understanding what we can actually get out of each of those, and making sure that we're not sort of pinning our hopes on something that maybe has a low ceiling. Understanding our tie-ins between rates and other DER signals, and just general enabling strategies. Making sure that we're thinking ahead about this idea of the possibility of shifting electric costs outside of the electric sector into taxes potentially, and just starting that conversation now, because we know that's a politically fraught conversation to have, but still an important one. And then thinking large scale too about just the supply side piece of this, and making sure that we're sort of set up, able to build to the capacity that we'll need for our winter heating needs. And then finally, looking at just generally how we can, exist in this winter peaking world, set ourselves up with the right policies, the right enabling technologies to shift and manage load, all without endangering energy affordability. So it's a big task out in front of us, but we've got a bit of a runway on it, and we're excited to sort of flag all of these pieces that we've dug into a bit here, but I think all require deeper looks as we move towards this future. So with that, I'll wind things up and hand it back to either Sarah or Austin, I think.